Welcome back and good day. When we last left our heroes, they were completing technical evaluation work, one of the three requirements in the HIPAA security rule, and generally one of the three requirements and foundation stones of any good cyber risk management program that you use as the basis to understand what controls you should implement. In this episode number 14, we're going to swing to the second requirement in the HIPAA security rule, that is to conduct a non-technical evaluation, also known as a compliance gap assessment. Fundamentally, the three elements that we'll be covering in this episode around compliance gap assessment are posing three questions over and over again. And those questions relate to each and every requirement that you're seeking to satisfy. The questions are, number one, do you have relevant, appropriate, and up-to-date policies and procedures? Number two, are you enforcing, abiding by, following your own written policies and procedures? And number three, whatever's going on in your organization, are you doing something reasonable and appropriate to meet that specific requirement? I'll also talk about what it means to think like a compliance analyst, as distinguished from what it means to think like a risk analyst, which we'll get into in the next episode. Before we dive in, as a quick reminder of where we are in our journey, I refer you to the slide that's shown at this point. I plan to record a total of 30 episodes. I may choose to add, delete, change along the way. I've made a couple of changes so far. And also, I would point out, if you've not already done so, you may wish to subscribe to the YouTube channel where all these episodes are posted. That way you'll be notified of any changes that we may make or new episodes that are posted. Additionally, feel free to post any feedback you may have on the YouTube channel. And last but not least, if you have any friends or colleagues whom you believe may benefit from this material in the episodes and the overall series, please feel free to share the YouTube channel and the link with them. Let's build out this slide and talk about what it means to think like a compliance analyst. That is, what are the kinds of things that would indicate compliance risk? Well, first of all, if you do not have appropriate policies and procedures related to a specific requirement in a regulation, or they're incomplete or out of date, that would be one potential scenario where you're out of compliance and potentially in violation of that regulation. Secondarily, even if you have the most brilliant policies and procedures in place, but they've become shelfware, no one's following them, you're not enforcing them, you're not abiding by them, that would be an example of compliance risk, and you're being in violation of that particular requirement. And then last but not least, you may have policies and procedures in place, and they may be something that the organization in total is following. That may be terrific, but they might not be reasonable and appropriate. Let me provide a couple of examples. Think about the HIPAA security rule for a moment. Among other standards and implementation specifications, there's one that calls for the designation of a security official. If you don't have a policy and procedure in place, that's one indication of a potential violation. If it's not in place, therefore you can't be following it. If, on the other hand, you have designated a security official and that person is performing in that capacity, well, you're probably meeting the third requirement of doing something reasonable and appropriate. Let's think about another example. The HIPAA security rule, as we've discussed, requires an enterprise-wide comprehensive risk analysis. Let's suppose you have a policy and procedure in place. Let's suppose that the last time you completed an enterprise-wide comprehensive risk analysis was in the year 2016, 5+ years ago. Well, you might in that particular case be found to be not following, abiding by, or enforcing your own policy and procedure. And therefore, when it comes to the third point, it would probably be difficult to judge that as being reasonable and appropriate. So just a couple of quick examples to think about. When it comes to compliance risk, it's a different mindset than when it comes to security risk. And we're going to tease that out further and make that distinction when we get into the next episode and talk specifically about risk analysis. Let me say it another way. to do a compliance assessment or a compliance gap assessment or what is labeled in the HIPAA security rule as a non-technical evaluation, it boils down to these three questions. And I would suggest to you that these are three questions that are relevant to any regulation with which you are trying to comply. Is it documented? That gets to the point we spoke about a moment ago, policies and procedures and relevant artifacts indicating that you're following that particular requirement. Number two, are you doing it? Are you using what you've stated, applying it, enforcing it, abiding by it? And last but not least, number three, is what you're doing reasonable and appropriate? Think about the HIPAA security rule for a moment. 5 major areas, 22 standards, over 50 so-called implementation specifications. I would suggest to you that what you would do in conducting a comprehensive compliance gap assessment is to step through every area, every standard, and at the so-called implementation specification level, pose these three questions. Whether it's related to the sanction policy implementation spec, the risk analysis implementation spec, the implementation spec about data backup, as well as the implementation spec about contingency planning. This is the essence of the OCR protocol, and this is the essence of a compliance gap assessment. By the way, the HIPAA security rule explicitly calls for this non-technical evaluation, as we discussed in a previous episode. Even though it's not explicitly required in the privacy rule and in the breach notification rule, I would encourage you to undertake a similar comprehensive review of your compliance activities vis-a-vis those regulations, as well as any other regulations with which your organization must comply. The bottom line is this: conducting a compliance gap assessment in a comprehensive manner, as we've discussed, will prepare you for an OCR investigation or inquiry or other review. As we wrap up, I'd like to make a very important point that's similar to the point I made at the end of the session on technical evaluation work. And it is simply this: a compliance assessment or compliance gap assessment is not a risk analysis. There continues to be great confusion over what a non-technical evaluation is and it is not. I can guarantee if you submit a compliance gap assessment to the Office for Civil Rights as your risk analysis, you are guaranteed to earn another F. The first one would have been if you had submitted your technical evaluation work as a substitute for your risk analysis. So what we covered in this episode was the concept of conducting a compliance gap assessment. While our focus is around HIPAA, specifically the HIPAA security rule, privacy rule, and breach notification rule, what we discussed in this episode applies to pretty much any regulation with which you must comply. It's all about showing that you have appropriate documentation, that you're enforcing it, and in the end, what you're doing is reasonable and appropriate. As I've said several times, and you're probably tired of hearing it, a compliance gap assessment does not constitute a risk analysis. As with every episode, I am ending with suggested actions as well as some references and resources. There are really some important ones in this section as it relates to helping to eliminate the confusion about technical evaluation versus compliance gap assessment versus risk analysis. Speaking of which, in the next episode, we will begin our discussion of an OCR quality risk analysis and start the journey by discussing 3 components of risk: an asset, a threat, and a vulnerability. Until then, be well, do subscribe to the YouTube channel, be secure, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.